Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Quick note before we begin, the Finding Genius Foundation, as part of the Finding Genius podcast, has recently completed a book about understanding viruses. So the creation of this book was to interview 100 virologists, ask them a lot of deep, difficult questions, take the most difficult questions, and then re-interview the top 25 or so and ask them the hardest questions I could think of. And we compiled that all into a book. So you'll see question and 4 or 5 experts' answers. Question, 4 or 5 experts' answers. There's about 30 questions in the book. I think it's a great read for the layperson and for the researcher. It talks about a lot of speculation in the world of viruses, such as are they alive or not, and why is it important? Why do viruses go latent or hidden or ineffective or sit in a person or an animal or another creature for weeks, months, years, and then suddenly become virulent and affect that person? So there's a lot of really provocative questions in the book. It's now on Amazon. So if you go to Amazon and type in Finding Genius, you'll see the book on viruses. It's also on Kindle. The Audible version is in production and should be ready in approximately a month. But if you want to go and order it now, you can do so again by going to Amazon or Kindle, or go to findinggeniusfoundation.org and go to publications. There's an opportunity as well to get the transcripts of all the interviews and to hear the original interviews themselves. If we put them all together, the book would be about 1,000 pages, but we condensed them down to make it juicy and concise and tight and very interesting. So I hope you'll check out the book. We're now working on one about cancer, but this is going to be our goal is 3 times a year to come out with these masterclass books that I think will inspire new scientific research, and I hope you'll check it out. Thank you.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. A quick note from our sponsor. We have a new book out called Understanding Viruses. It asks a lot of provocative questions. It can be found on Amazon by typing in Finding Genius, based on interviews with 25 top-end virologists. We asked them all the same questions, and we gathered their answers. So check it out on Amazon, Kindle, and soon to be Audible. Today, my special guest is Patrícia Chrzanová. She's a research assistant, part of computational and RNA biology, all at the University of Copenhagen. And the reason I'm talking to her is they were able to find the oldest ever DNA, I guess, from a 1,000,000-year-old woolly mammoth and sequence it. So, Patrcia, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Well, tell me about your research.
So in general, my research interests are kind of drifting between ancient DNA and paleogenetics, so reconstructing evolutionary history of species and population history. And then also they are kind of drifting towards conservation biology, so trying to protect species and trying to understand how we can help them survive. So I'm kind of trying to understand both the evolutionary history and maybe try to help the future a little bit. All of this from genetic perspective.
How did you, so the article I read said that you had sequenced DNA from woolly mammoths. Like, how did you find them? Where were they? What's the background story of it?
So the story actually goes back all the way to 1970s when a Russian paleontologist named Andrei Sher excavated several molars of mammoths from well-described section called Oleorian, and it's a geological section. So it's a place in the stratigraphy where we kind of know the age, at least approximately, and we knew that these teeth were somewhere between 600,000 to, let's say, 1.2 million years old. And back then, the ancient DNA field didn't even exist. And as it evolved, maybe in 2007 was the first attempt to get DNA out of these old teeth. But back then, technologies even were not that well developed and were not ready, kind of. So it was only 10 years later, in 2017, when I was actually doing my PhD studying the woolly mammoths. And we decided to try once more with these really old ones. And we used the newest techniques. Now the field is finally ready, and we employ all of these lab methods and all the bioinformatic methods. And we actually did manage to get DNA out of these really old teeth.
How many different mammoths did you get DNA from?
So we looked at 3 samples. They range between approximately 700,000 years and 1.2 million years. And this is basically the 3 samples that we worked on in this study.
How did you extract the DNA? Did you look at like the mammoth's tusks, or what part of it was preserved best that you had?
Yeah, so all that we know about is molars, is the teeth. So basically, mammoths, similarly as elephants, they have these deciduous teeth, which means that they exchange teeth through their life, like, for example, humans do, but they have only these molars that are on each side of their jaw, and in the upper jaw and in the lower jaw. And basically throughout life, they have 6 sets of these teeth. And they get bigger and bigger as the animal grows as well. And they also get worn out because they use them to grind grass. So they need to replace them. And it's teeth in general are made of very sturdy and good quality material for DNA preservation. And it's also something that's usually what we find. So teeth is the only thing that we've got left of these mammoths, because everything else got degraded over time. So it was this teeth that we used, and which we used also to extract the DNA.
Okay, very cool. Did you notice differences between the 3 different mammoths, or between the left or right molar if you took both?
So we only got, for each of the mammoths, we only get 1 tooth. So there's not much left. So and it's not usually even like completely preserved. So it might be just part. In general, the teeth were found in different layers, as I mentioned. So they are different age. And we could also see that the oldest tooth, the oldest mammoth, was the worst preserved. So it had the least DNA content out of all 3. So that was the one of the particular problems that we had to work with to get DNA even out of the very old one.
How good was the sequencing? Like, what do we know about mammoth DNA? Is it similar to elephant DNA? I mean, where does it fall, like in the evolutionary, diagram of creatures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so elephants are the closest living relatives for mammoths. The closest one is the Asian elephant, and then the next one is the African elephant. And what we think, or what we know from the molecular dating, is that they probably split from the African elephant about 5 million years ago, somewhere between 5 to 7 million years ago, depends on the analysis, and there's some confidence intervals around it, but approximately 5 million years ago. So that's kind of a reasonable divergence time to work with in terms of genetics and sequencing. So even, for example, humans and chimps are approximately 5 million years of divergence time. So that helped us a lot, because we do actually have very good genomic data from elephants. Particularly, there's a very good reference genome from the African savanna elephant. So that helped us to work with these old samples in terms of genetic analysis.
So what's interesting about elephant DNA and mammoth DNA? Anything that's really peculiar about it?
That's a very interesting question. I don't think anybody has ever asked me this. I think there are several very interesting things. In one way, elephants and mammoths are very important species in the ecosystem, not just sort of from the human perspective, because they are large and cute and interesting animals, but also sort of in general for the ecosystem, because of course they are a big animal and they are very important for their ecosystem. They produce a lot of biomass, they consume a lot of the biomass, so they form also the environment. That's also why, for example, the environment where the mammoths lived, the steppe tundra, it was called the Mammoth steppe tundra, because these animals just sort of define how the habitat looks like also for the other species. And we call species like this the keystone species. So in a way, it's very interesting to understand the evolution of these species and how they manage to colonize the whole world. And basically, mammoths evolved from the common ancestor with elephants in Africa, and they managed to colonize the whole northern hemisphere, basically. So it's very interesting to see and look at, for example, the adaptations, how they managed to adapt to the cold environment, how they managed to survive all of these climatic cycles, and evolved in so many different forms as well. So there has been several species of mammoths themselves. So from the evolutionary history perspective, this is very interesting.
Yeah, how old were the mammoths that you sampled? Could you tell? And how far apart in time were they? Like, what were the relative timescales in which they lived?
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Yeah, exactly. So from stratigraphy, from the geological position of the samples, we know that the youngest one was approximately 700,000 years old. The next one was approximately 1.1 million, and the last one 1.2 million years old. So that's the time scale that we've been working on.
Well, that's cool. Do you ever tell people that it was a mammoth undertaking?
Yeah, definitely. I don't usually do this, but yeah, it definitely was.
That's cool. That's cool. So again, what was unique about the oldest one versus the newest one? What could you tell that there were climate differences, or was it so close together that the climate was the same? What did you notice?
Yeah, so they were all very different, and it was also quite difficult to figure it out in the beginning. So what we knew from the morphology and from the timing was that the youngest one was likely an early form of a woolly mammoth. Then the 2 older ones, morphologically, they sort of fit with the look of a steppe mammoth. So in the evolution of the mammoth lineage, there have been several species that in a way were like chronospecies. So they sort of go one after the other in terms of the timeline, but they also overlap. At least that's as much as we know. So what we thought was that the 2 of our oldest samples were steppe mammoths or something that looked like that, and the youngest one was a woolly mammoth. And that's how we approached it also in our analysis. But then, interestingly, we saw that the oldest one, the one which was 1.2 million years old, didn't quite fit with the picture. And then we found out that it actually was a new genetic lineage, or it was a different genetic lineage than the other one. And that was really surprising because nothing before told us that there was more than one type of mammoth back in the Siberia back in sort of 1 million years ago.
So was there like a Neanderthal mammoth that kind of disappeared early on? Like what was the latest mammoth type? Did it have a name? The youngest type that's ever been observed, and how different is it from these?
Yeah, so before these guys, before the steppe mammoths and woolly mammoths, there have been actually several others. So before that, there was a southern mammoth, which lived a little bit. So this one lived before Pleistocene started. So it was while the climate was a bit warmer. So it was much more sort of closer to elephants, sort of, if we say it in a very general way. But before that, there were also other forms. So there was even this mammoth called Mammoths suplaniformis. So that was much more, in terms of timeline, primitive mammoth, much more early mammoth. So these were sort of the advanced form already.
Okay. Well, what other differences do you notice, either in the DNA or the gene expression, or, the commonality or the divergence of their genes? I mean, what did you notice overall? How does this fit into the picture for you and advance the picture of mammoths?
So with the oldest one, it was a bit difficult because we've got the least data. As I said, it was more degraded because it was the oldest one. So we were struggling a bit with getting enough data, and we did not include it in the analysis of, for example, adaptations. But with the 2 other ones, with the genomes, which were 1.1 million years old and 700,000 years old, it was actually interesting because we saw that the older one was ancestral to the younger one, which helped us do analysis which look at the evolution. So we can look at the older and the younger and see what changes happen in between. And we can also compare them to the late Pleistocene woolly mammoths. So those that we know much more about, those that are 50,000 years old and younger. And we have many samples for these, and we have already quite some genomic data for these. So we could actually look at this timeline and sort of look at where and what was happening in their genome. And one of the things was looking at typical adaptations that we consider sort of the woolly mammoth adaptations. We know this from the late Pleistocene samples. We know several genes that are involved in, for example, thermoregulation, the brown fat deposits, the long fur, and so on. And we could look into our two genomes and see how many of these typical woolly mammoth adaptations are already present in these. And we were actually quite surprised because more than 80% of these were in both of them. So it wasn't just in the woolly mammoth, in the early form of the woolly mammoth, the one.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Which was 700,000 years old, but also in the older one, which was supposed to be the ancestor of the woolly mammoth. And that was quite surprising and in some ways, but very interesting that we could show this.
So what do the steppe mammoths look like versus the woolies? The woolies, I guess, I imagine, they're very woolly, but what about the steppe ones? What's different about them?
Yeah, so exactly. So this 1.1 million year old genome, it could have been a steppe mammoth. It was likely something which looked like the steppe mammoth. The problem is that we can't really say that it was a steppe mammoth because they have been described, the holotype, the sort of the individual which is the defining for the species. That one comes from Europe. I think it's about 600,000 years old, the steppe mammoth. So we would need DNA from this lineage, from these samples, to be able to say and confirm that the ones that we have are the same lineage. So until we have that, we can only say that they look like the steppe mammoth. But since we think they might have represented this, and we did this analysis showing that they already had all the adaptations, or not all, but 80% of them, more than that, the same adaptations that the woolly mammoths had. They quite likely looked quite similar in terms of the long fur, the brown fat, the good deposit, and the good adaptations for a cold climate.
So why do you study the mammoths? Why do people study them in general? Are they just a window of time where it's very rare to find any creatures? Or is it because not only are they a keystone creature, but they were around at an interesting time in history?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think both of these things likely played a very important role. So one thing would be definitely that mammoths lived in the right kind of environment. So for ancient DNA, the best preservation happens in a cold and stable environment. So, for example, permafrost, the perennially frozen ground, is the best kind of environment you can have so that the DNA stays stable and doesn't degrade, and that we can recover it apparently even million years later. So one thing is that mammoths lived in this very cold environment where we have enough of the samples with good DNA. The second thing is obviously that mammoths are somehow very attractive to humans, I guess because they are interesting animals, because they have been important for humans in the past as well. There are all these cave paintings, and we know that mammoths were important for humans in historical and ancient times as well. So I guess there's always been some kind of fascination with these animals.
Yeah, people like big creatures, and I think anyone that hasn't been attacked by an elephant probably would be curious about it. They're amazed. So yeah, I'm sure a bigger, woollier one is even more cuddly, or interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there are different aspects of this, and that good DNA preservation also helped mammoths being one of those species that always was kind of on the forefront of ancient DNA research. So one of the earliest genomic data came from woolly mammoths. One of the earliest ancient DNA actually came from the woolly mammoths as well. So if we don't look at humans and Neanderthals and ancient humans, I mean, in terms of the animal ancient DNA research, mammoths were always kind of up there, being the flagship species in some ways.
What's next for your research? Their DNA has been sequenced. Well, I forgot to ask, was it completely sequenced, or you're only getting part of their DNA? Do they have, just, I don't know, anything special or interesting about their DNA in general versus elephants? So is it complete what you have, or is it very fragmented?
So it's definitely not complete. So what we work with here is so the youngest sample, the one which is 700,000 years old, that one we have at something more than 1x coverage, meaning that each position in the genome is covered at least once, but it's on average. So that means that we do have some parts of the genome which are covered more than that, and some parts which are not covered at all. And for the other two older samples, it's worse. So we don't have the full coverage. Sort of, we don't have the 1X genome, which we could say then that we have the full genome. But we do have quite a good representation of the genome. So quite a lot of the positions and good part to sort of be able to analyze these things that we've managed to do. So with this kind of degradation, so to all the samples, they had 1 to 2% endogenous DNA content, which means that that's the authentic DNA in the sample. So when we sequence everything which is in the sample, meaning that most of it is going to be bacteria and contamination from the environment, from the time when the animal died all the way to present, and the soil that the bone was buried in or the tooth was buried in, or the contamination from whoever touched it or sneezed on the bone. We try to minimize this as much as we can in the lab, but it's still there. So that's one of the tricky parts of working with this kind of DNA, as well as the fragmentation, because the DNA degrades. So it's shorter and shorter, which results in us being able to recover a small but still good part of the genome in some ways.
Is there any part of the teeth that were virgin, were untouched? Any microenvironment that again was unseen by the air or by people until you guys worked on the sample?
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we are always trying to find, and you have to be a bit lucky about this because, well, we can always sort of remove the surface layer, which is going to be the most likely to be contaminated, and then you try to find a piece which doesn't seem to have any cracks, along which the bacteria could invade the bone or the tooth. So you try to kind of find this part which is very, very hard, very sturdy, because that means that it's also going to be resistive to bacteria as well. But it's not always easy to choose as well. For example, with teeth like this, it's you don't really want to destroy the whole tooth, so we usually just get a small subsample, and there's not so much choice. But and then it's always a bit about luck to find the right spot to not hit the pocket of bacteria which is in there.
Well, you might want to, separately analyze the bacteria that's trapped in there. That might be great. If they're trapped inside the tooth for a million years, that might be. Yeah,
definitely. That's one of the things that people are starting to work on. It's a bit, it's still a little bit difficult in some ways, because also the bacterial reference database is still only being filled, and kind of putting these bacteria, the old ones, into perspective and deciding if they are really that old, considering like how fast their generation time and everything is. It's a bit more complicated in some ways. It's not like when you have a mammoth and you can clearly see if it's been contaminated with something else, with a dog or so. That's much easier than kind of showing that the bacteria that we find in there are really that old, and they are from the time when the animal died. It's going to be also much easier sort of to contaminate it with the modern day bacteria.
Are there other creatures that lived a little bit before the mammoths or lived with them but predated them, that had nice juicy teeth for you to sample? I don't know if saber-toothed tigers were way before them, or is there any other, rhinoceroses or anything that lived around their time that, again, would take you back a little further?
Yeah, for sure. There's going to be other species that lived alongside mammoths up there. I don't know, to be honest, exactly which species developed, but definitely at least their predecessors. So this kind of high latitude fauna with woolly rhinoceroses, horses, bison, and so on was up there. So there's certainly space for more discoveries. I don't know exactly which species or which ones lived up there, but we do think that now we sort of open a new window into this really old-time genetics, and there's certainly going to be more discoveries, and we think that it is possible that people will go at least to 2 million maybe.
Is there any known interaction between hominids and mammoths at that time? Is there a lot of interaction? At the million-year ago mark?
Yeah, so back then, our ancestor, modern humans or the ancient humans, didn't even exist, or the Neanderthals and Denisovans did not exist at the time. So it would have to be all the way back. So that's actually quite interesting when we start looking at these really ancient timelines. And people often don't even sort of, or didn't think about it sort of until this point. I have been working with my PhD on the very last population of the woolly mammoths. So sort of working in the last 10,000 years. So even for me, it's very interesting to suddenly think about a time scale where we have samples 1 million years old, and the environments were very different, and also what we know about them is very different. So we don't have quite the luxury as we do with samples, let's say 10,000 years old, of having a very good record of radiocarbon dates, knowing how old the samples are, knowing how the climate looked like, knowing which species live there. With these really old ones, with samples which are 1 million years old, it's a bit, we have to rely much more on the geology, the stratigraphy, for example, dating through things like volcanic eruptions, magnetic reversals. And it's a very different way of studying this evolutionary history.
And just last question or so, you said elephants are the most similar to them, but what's different about mammoths versus elephants? If I look at an elephant today, what would be different about a mammoth?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm always thinking about this more from the perspective of in what way they are similar. So interesting to think about in what they are different. I think it's actually very surprising in how similar they were. So we think that they had very similar social structures, for example, and also sort of, so what do we know about the biology of mammoths? We very much base on what we know about elephants. So it's kind of difficult to know something about animal from its bones only. But what we know about mammoths is a lot based on, for example, also these like frozen bodies or mummified bodies, or we found their coprolines or even footsteps. And it's quite surprising that all of these things point us to thinking that they were very similar to elephants in terms of social structure, behavior, and things like that. But of course, it's really difficult to say things like, did they have similar communication, memory, and things like that as elephants do? That's very difficult to do just with fossils.
So what's next with your mammoth work? What do you want to focus on next? You said your PhD is on the most recent mammoths.
So I actually, even though I'm still working on some projects from my PhD, I'm now working on different things. So I'm actually working on a different Arctic animal, on muskox. But I'm also going to be working on elephants soon. I'm starting a new project in June. But I'm still a little bit tied to my mammoth work, which I did in Stockholm during my PhD. But they are certainly continuing. So there are other PhD students and postdocs working on the mammoth project. And yeah, as I said, the work is mostly focused on the last population of mammoths. We are studying a lot what happened before they went extinct. Certainly, they're also looking at these very old ones, and they want to focus more on getting more of these mammoths working, because the 3 samples that we analyzed were not the only ones that we got from Andrej Scher. So we would like to try to get more DNA, even from the old timelines.
Yeah, very, very cool. Well, Patricia, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work? Where can they go?
So I'm quite active on Twitter, where I post about my work at Patrícia Chrzanová, which is CHRZAN. And so I am trying to kind of disseminate a lot of my work through Twitter and sharing what I'm doing, and trying also a bit working on science communication and disseminating research to the public as well. So
okay, well, very good. Patricia, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.